quota means you have to check the imports. How you will check the imports? You can check the imports by allowing fixed quantities, right? So quota is nothing but it is allowing fixed number of things to get imported into the country. It is quantitative, right? Quantitative means you are restricting the imports quantitatively. One term is qualitative, right? That we will discuss when we will discuss in WTO. That means you can restrict the imports in two terms. One is quantitative, other is qualitative. Quantitative means you can restrict the quantity, right? For example, you fix that television in India can be imported only in 100 numbers, right? So you cannot import any television beyond number 100, right? So this is quota system. And other is if you talk about qualitative. Qualitative means, for example, if you have gone through the news stories, then you might be hearing that in UK, this Britain asked India to check its imports of mangoes, right? Alfonso, because they said that your mango does not fit into the SPS, sanitary phytosanitary requirements, right? That is something qualitative. That means they are saying that you are using more pesticide. For example, you are using child labor in the production, right? So on these basis, they can restrict the imports, right? So quota, license RAS and permit RAS were prevalent with huge government interventions leading to inefficiencies. That means at that time, there was so much of the government control. It is also said to the inspector RAS, right? That people were fed up of the system and overall there were inefficiencies in the system. Prevailing inefficiencies resulted in the losses of PSUs, increasing the fiscal deficit. I discussed you with one thing, that what was happening at that time, the government came up with the idea of the PSUs with the idea that these PSUs will lead to the profits to the government, right? But things go otherwise. The PSUs resulted into the inefficiencies, right? And it led to the fiscal deficits. After that, government was having less resources to invest. It is self-explanatory because the objective of the PSUs was basically profits, but it was resulting into the losses. So it resulted into the inefficiencies. Because there were inefficiencies in the public sector units or the government has to put resources in the functioning of all those PSUs. So less resources were left with the government to get invested. And that's why, because the less resources were available with the government, so GDP growth rate was also less. Because when we were discussing about ICR, incremental capital output ratio, there's something input required, right? Or if you can recall what we were discussing about planning, then Harrod-Domar model stated that we require input, right? So if we are not having input in the form of investment, because we were having less investment, so less investment means less GDP growth, right? Then came closed economy. Closed economy means you were not connected to the world, marked by import substitution, less interactions with the global economy, right? Rupee was non-convertible, right? This we will discuss later on. Right now, you have to understand only that rupee non-convertible means that what happens nowadays, that if you want to convert dollar, you can go to the market and convert that dollar into the rupee or vice versa. But in those times, for converting dollar into rupee or vice versa, you have to approach RBI, means banks, or any office or agency appointed by RBI to exchange, right? There were proper forex agencies, right, or shops which were authorized by RBI. Those were controlled by RBI, right? Now these are available in the free market, right? At that time it was controlled. Right now it is not controlled. In 1980s, government expenditures exceeds its revenue to the extent that it becomes unsustainable to meet the expenditure even through borrowings. It was the imminent reason, right? All these things, all these reasons were since 1947 or 50s, but this reason was the imminent reason, right? It was the tipping point when the government decided to take up the reforms. So these were the immediate reasons for reforms. So if you see this war in Iraq, Iran, it led to rise in petrol prices. So here we will understand this another classification of inflation. This is imported inflation. Imported inflation means that we were discussing, when we were discussing inflation, then we discussed one thing, that fuel inflation Can anybody tell me that it is a part of core inflation or non-core inflation? Is fuel inflation part of core inflation or non-core inflation? It's a part of core inflation. Why is it core? What is the core inflation? Core inflation does not fluctuates. Core inflation, food and fuel inflation are fluctuating inflations. That's why we have the concept of core inflation, right? That means fuel inflation is non-core inflation, right? Headline minus core inflation is equals to food plus fuel inflation. Food and fuel are not involved in core. Also, the service sector was. See, simple. Core inflation simply means the inflation which is not fluctuating, right? And food and fuel are the part of the inflation which are fluctuating. That means they can't be the part of the core inflation, right? So when we discuss about the inflation in detail, we discuss that why RBI is following the core inflation, because food and fuel inflation are fluctuating. So RBI policy cannot be sustainable because fuel is changing every day, right? If RBI came up with a policy keeping in mind the fuel prices, then the very next day the fuel prices will change. Then again RBI will be meeting in the so RBI will be meeting day by every day to deal with all these changes. That's why RBI take into account the core inflation, which is non-fluctuating, right? So headline inflation minus core, this food and fuel inflation is called as core inflation, right? And headline inflation is nothing but what we hear in day to day, right? Imported inflation means this fuel inflation is said to be the imported inflation because this inflation is not created within the country, because oil prices are not in the control of India. They are controlled by the international agencies. For example, we are importing our oil from Middle East, right? So that is being controlled by OPEC and a number of agencies, right? That means if prices are increased, India is having least control on that type of inflation. That's why it is said to be the imported inflation, right? Do you having any query regarding this, that I am saying that imported inflation is that India is, the country is not having any effect on the prices of petrol? Do you having any question? I was expecting question on this from your side. Any query? That I am saying fuel inflation, can we say that fuel inflation is, why do people blame government and when prices increase? Yes. Any other question? This is a less pointed question, right? But I'm getting a point. Not understood as a result of war, there is inflation in your food prices. See, if you can recall the times of 1990s, we are having something called, if you see nowadays what the opposition parties are arguing on the government, they are saying that in the times of Manmohan Singh or UPA 2, the oil prices in the world were around more than $120 per barrel, right? Yes, Krishnakant, this is the pointed question. What Krishnakant has raised, that is the pointed question. I was expecting this question. I am coming to that answer only, right? If you have gone through the arguments of the these opposition parties, right, and in social media, people are arguing that in the times of Manmohan Singh, the oil prices abroad in the international market were around $120 per barrel, right? And nowadays it is around 40 or 50, right, dollar per barrel, right? So despite that, nowadays I'm not aware about the prices in Telangana, but in this UP we are having around more than 80, right? Prices are more than 80 rupees per liter, right? Even in those times, in the times of UPA 2, these prices have not crossed 80, right? So that means, what is the reason? The reason is government has increased the duties. This is the reason, duties. That means what we are saying, that the government can restrict the imports, right? So one was quota, and other quantitative term is increasing the duty. Yes, excise duty, increasing the duties, or in simple term, taxes, right? So nowadays your import duties are very high, right? So that is the reason that prices are very high. So in this case, you cannot say that we are nowadays inflation in the fuel is, can be said that it is not imported inflation, because in the world oil prices nowadays are low, but in India we are having costly petrol, because, so we can say that nowadays it is not imported inflation. See, such questions you should be clear with the concepts that why something is happening, because normally it is said that fuel results in imported inflation in case of India. But nowadays, it is not the case with India, because nowadays inflation in the fuel prices is not imported inflation. Keep it in mind. Normally, it is said to be imported inflation, but nowadays it is not imported inflation because the duties are very high, right? Next. So at that time in 1990s, Iraq-Iran war led to rise in petrol prices, and it resulted into the imported inflation, right? External and internal factors resulted high inflation, right? It was in the range of 16.7. Huge non-developmental expenditure, because we discussed that public sector units were in losses, right? Losses were increasing. And what was happening, that these losses were compensated by increasing the fiscal deficit, right? So this fiscal deficit was consistently increasing to compensate all these losses. And despite that, the revenue expenditure of the government, right, it was increasing in the form of salaries and operation and maintenance, all those things. Government liabilities increased to the extent that borrowing was insufficient for the government, right? That means borrowings were not sufficient to fulfill the government liabilities, right? India's Forex Reserve at its ebb, resulting in the adverse balance of payment, right? And we were not having enough Forex to sustain imports for 2 weeks, right? That was a situation in those times. So what was the situation at that time? We were having external debt around $84 billion. Forex reserve was only around 1.2. Can you tell me what is the Forex reserve nowadays? Any idea how much Forex reserve we are having now? Approx. Correct. 500 billion. It's around 520. Correct. Correct. It's around 500. So at that time it was only 1.2 billion. Vishnu, it's 500 plus. It's around 520. In 1st of September, it was around 520. Right. Hindu growth rate of, and we were growing below 5%. It was in the range of 3 to 5. Inflation rate, right? Inflation rate was higher. CAD, this we will discuss in trade, right? It was very high. This data is being released by the RBI, Reserve Bank of India. Nowadays, you are here. You will be hearing about this Forex Reserve. I think every week RBI is releasing this data, and this data is being changing every week, because in June I think it was around 500, and in the at the end of July it was 523 something. Now coming to the international events and LPG reforms. See, at that time, it was, if you have gone through, if you are going through this world history, so you will be seeing that if you post World War II, it was happening that people were, you have gone through the idea of how did the Forex increase when the trade is hit bad. We'll be discussing, I think in coming slide, I'll discuss a bit, but this in elaboratedly, we will discuss it in trade, but a bit I'll discuss. See, if you can recall, in the world history, so world history, what was happening after World War II? So World War II gave rise to the concept of big government, right? And the most popular economist at that time, Keynesian economics. So these people were advocating for not only the big government at the national level, but they were also advocating at the development of the international inspectors, international policing. So if you can recall, at that time the came of the concept Bretton Woods institutions, right? So at that time there came the concept of World Bank, right? IMF, right? And later on this WTO, father of macroeconomics, JMPs. Yes, Keynes, right? So all these, the meaning of these United Nations, right? United Nations. So the idea of all these institutions were bringing a regime of international policing, right? International policing, or the concept of the big government at the international level. That means you were saying that the government should be involved in each sphere of the individual, right? From womb to tomb, right? Means from the birth to the death, right? The government should be involved, right? So what was happening in those times, the government undertook all the aspects, right? So at that time, the socialism, the idea of the socialism was very popular, right? And capitalism was in the hindsight. And at that time, Russia, USSR, the then USSR was flourishing. Only USSR was flourishing. And that gave rise to the idea that socialism is good than the capitalism, right? And at that, these were the times when these Marxism and all those ideas came into being, and that you will be discussing in your political theory and all those things, right? And if you came to China, China in late 1980s under Jiapong undertook market-friendly reforms, right? That means by 80s, what happened in 80s? I said now that in 1980s it was being realized that the what we adopted after World War II, that means idea of socialism or the idea of the big government, to an extent, this idea could not bring people out of the poverty, right? So in during these 1980s came up the idea we were discussing about that the idea of development, right? And then another idea came, the idea of capitalism, right? And this USSR was collapsed during these times, 1990s. USSR was collapsed. If you can recall, there's perestroika and glasnost, right? And in 1980s, China adopted market-friendly regimes. That means arrival of the capitalism in China. And this 1980s Iran-Iraq war resulted in the collapse, economic shocks across the world, and this Asian financial crisis, right? All these things led to the idea that the government should not be in the business of business, right? And that gave to the idea of adoption of the new economic policy in 1991 in India. And this policy was, there were three pillars of this policy: liberalization, privatization, and globalization. And there were two basic components of these reforms. One was structural and another was stabilization. Structural, as I have already discussed, the structural simply means these are long-term reforms. These are not overnight reforms, while stabilization measures are actually these are type stabilization measure is a sort of steroid. That means fast at once. You are trying to give relief to the country at that point of time very fast, right? It's like fast food something. That means you want to give steroid to the economy so that the economy can be stabilized at that point of time. Structural reform means it requires a reform across the economy, and it is long term, right? And it is the change in fundamental structures, right? So whenever technically, if you ask that what is LPG, it is basically structural reform. Keep it in mind, it is structural reform. Under 1991, it is structural reform. So this is privatization, liberalization, globalization. So if you see this privatization in itself is clear. So liberalization, we'll discuss it in the next slides, right? So LPG, technically, if you see, LPG is basically structural reform. It's not stabilization measures. So 1991 reforms were about structural and stabilization measures. Structural reforms were long-term reforms. Stabilization measures were short-term reforms. So short-term reforms were basically stabilization reforms. So devaluation of the currency, right? Stabilization measures. These are short-term measures intended to correct some of the weaknesses that had developed in the balance of payment and to bring inflation under control. That means you devalue your currency, right? What will be the impact of devaluation of the currency on exports? Can anybody tell me? Or why we devalued our currency? Any idea? What is the impact of devaluation of currency on the imports or exports? Boost exports, actually, correct. I think we have discussed this idea in the previous class. Whenever the currency, yes, we are devaluating the currency, it is basically increasing our exports. And structural reforms are essentially measures that change the basic fabric or the fundamental of an economy. The institutional means the institutions. You are changing the institutions. Regulatory framework, that means you are bringing in the regulations in which business and people operate. Improving the efficiency of the economy, increasing the international competitiveness by removing the rigidities in the economies. These are necessary to ensure growth in the long term. LPG reforms are part of structural economy, structural reforms, right? So it was basically, if you see this cartoon, so Manmohan Singh is saying exit policy and golden handshake. Can we increase the value of currency by any policy? Yes, we can do it. We'll discuss it. We can do it. And this is new economic policy. What this new economic policy is saying? This is IMF loan, this is World Bank loan, this is foreign money. That means this all is we are bringing in money from abroad, right? This is basically the idea that why this is foreign treatment, how we are attracting the money from abroad, right? And this was only possible by attracting the foreign investors by liberalizing the economies or by doing away with the rigidities in the economy. So this LPG reform was all about bringing in flexibility in the economy through these LPG reforms, right? Was quantitative easing part of this? Then you see, quantitative easing is basically a new idea, right? This is new idea because this is unconventional part. Yes, you can say one thing, that it can be said to be unconventional in the sense that the currency was devalued to a very large extent. We'll discuss in the next slide that what at that time we were having rupee was around something 22 rupees per dollar, right? And we devalue it to the level of 60 something, right? So it was devaluation was done by the intervention of the RBI. Right. So in that sense, you can say that it was unconventional, but the idea of quantitative easing was not at that time. Right. So this is LPG. First, we will be discussing liberalization. Liberalization means that you are reducing. See, liberalization means that you are increasing the flexibility, nothing else. Right. So reduction of government regulations and restrictions in the country, so that private players can work with fewer without restrictions. So liberalization is nothing but doing away with the restrictions, right? This is all about liberalization. So the objective is to bring more competition into the economy with the aim of increasing efficiency. See, bringing in the economy to increase efficiency. Can anybody give me the example? How competition, bringing into the competition, increase the efficiency? Any example, simple example, any example of any sector? Telecom. Yes, correct. See, telecom is the example which you can even correlate from 90s till now, right? If you see, I think you are clear with the concept of bringing in the competition by how competition brings in efficiency, because you can correlate it with the times of BSNL and MTNL to the times of these private players, right? I think there is no issue of that. Now, again, coming to the thing that how doing away with the competition brings inefficiency in the system, or not inefficiency in the system, you can say bringing cost to the people. Take the example what is happening in the economy right now. See, prior to this Geo, right, what happens when Geo came into the scenario? Yes, it kills innovation. What happens that Geo provided everything free to the people, right? And by doing this, what we discuss, it is predatory pricing. Predatory pricing. Can you tell me any agency which is there to deal with all these issues like predatory pricing, or any to check to bring in competition? CCI, correct. Competition Commission of India, right? It checks the predatory pricing in the country. Now see this, when Geo came into scenario, what it did, that it came with the freebies, right? It was giving free data, free talk time, and everything was free. And because of that free, this concept predatory pricing, and because of predatory pricing, it captured the whole market. And after capturing the whole market, because it made all the business unviable to other players, right? Because when the subscribers of the Airtel are decreasing, ultimately the revenues will decrease, and the reduction in the revenues results in non-sustainable to all these players, right? So they can sustain for a quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters, right? But not beyond that. So they could only sustain all these this predatory pricing for a year or year and a half, right? But beyond that, once the market was captured by the Geo, and you will realize that what is the strategy of Geo. Now they have started increasing the prices, and now they are coming up with the idea and saying to the government, because already the business is unsustainable to other players, so they will always prefer that the rates will be high, rates will be increased, right? And Geo is putting the argument that now these data prices should be increased. So what is the idea? That means after a year or two, other players will appear to be obsolete, right? Or they will be non-viable in the system, and there will be only a single player in the system, and that player will ultimately lead to will run the market as per their whims and fancies, right? So this is the issue, that there should be players in the economies, right? To bring in competition into the economy. When there is competition into the economy, then only efficiency will be there. Otherwise, a single player or monopoly or oligopoly will only lead to hardships to the people, right? Might be a possibility that it will not increase inefficiency, but definitely it will increase hardships to the people, right? So ultimately that means inefficiency in the to the pockets of the people, right? So next it was to unlock the economic potential by encouraging the private sector and bringing MNCs, improvement of technology. So what I discussed when we discuss LPG, so LPG is basically about bringing this foreign capital, technology, learn these things, right? And one thing is management, foreign management, right? Capital, technology. These are critical to the idea of the liberalization, right? Debt burden, to diminish the debt burden. That how liberalization lead to the lessening of the debt burden. Actually, how it is possible? It is possible because when your borders are opened or your economy is being opened, then there will be investment, right? For example, if you see at that time we were having only 1.2 something billion of dollars. Now we are having 520 billion of dollars, and that is in the form of investment. That means that at that time we were not having enough dollars to invest. That means we were borrowing dollars, right? That means borrowing means we were increasing debt. But what is happening now? We are already having 520 billion dollars. That means we need not require any foreign debt to import anything. We are already having huge dollars with us. So what is the need of borrowing the dollars from the abroad, right? So that means it is the idea of diminishing the debt burden of the country, to reduce the role of public sector in future industrial development. This we will discuss later on in the coming slides. We encourage foreign trade with other countries with regulated imports and exports. It is self-explanatory. Industrial sector reforms. This is basically the idea that what was happening in those times, that industrial, what we discuss in the license Raj, that means licensing was required for everything, almost everything. But after these reforms, this licensing concept was abolished, with certain exceptions like explosives, alcohol and hazardous chemicals, right? And secondly, small scale industries. Can anybody tell me that reservation of goods produced by small scale industries was resulting into inefficiency in the system? Can anybody explain me this? Reservation of goods to the small scale industries is supposed to be one of the reasons for bringing in inefficiency or less competitiveness in the these goods. One of the reasons why we are not in a position to compete qualitatively in the international market is because of the reservation of goods for small scale industries. See, the less quality products but at affordable rates. The less quality products, the industries remain small, technology use, quality of goods, their capital investment will be low. Correct. See, what was happening by reserving certain good, all at that time, almost everything was, most of the things were reserved for that they can be only produced by small scale industries. Now, what were the restrictions in the small scale industries? That sorry, there were restrictions of capital. For example, you can only, let's take an example that you can only involve 10 crores of capital. If you are talking of 10 crores, that means the technology, because technology needs capital, right? And you are restricting the capital. That means you cannot have the desired technology, right? No desired technology. When there is less capital, less technology, and there was less R&D, in the sense that R&D again requires capital, right? And these sectors were having less foreign in FDI. There was no FDI at that time. The idea of FDI was not there, right? So bigger industrialists were not interested, right? They were not. That means, and most of the goods were reserved for small scale industries. So that means the goods which were reserved for small scale industries, the quality of all those goods, first thing, they were costly because you were not using technology, you were not using this R&D, right? So the idea of economy of scale. So the goods produced by small scale industries were not cheaper. They were comparatively costlier. Keep it in mind. See, this is the only idea. If you can recall that why handlooms of independent or during the time of British India, handlooms could not compete with the products produced by the factories of Britain because handlooms were costly, while the products produced from or manufactured from the industries of the Britain was comparatively cheaper. Right. So at that time, the goods produced by small scale industries were comparatively costly and of less quality. But because we were having a closed economy, the people have to bear with this. Right? There were no options before the people. For example, if you are having if you are using these agarbattis or any toys, right? Any toys in your this for children, right? At that time, all these things were being produced by the small scale industries, right? Or any products which are used in the houses, right? They were costly as well as having a less quality, right? So in 1990s, it was realized that all these things, that is the reason why we could not compete with the world after opening up of the economy, because we were having costly products of the less quality. And when the economy was open, people realized that they can have the cheaper products and higher quality, right? So naturally, in the globalized market, everybody is going for the quality, right? That's why this industry is one of the reasons that why we could not compete with the world in the era of the globalization. Right. All industries reserved for the public sector were now open to private sector except railway, defense, and atomic energy. I think I have already told you that the government has revised the idea of the strategic and non-strategic, that I'll be discussing later on. Most of the goods price were decontrolled. That means decontrolled in the sense that initially what was happening, the government used to fix the prices. For example, they will announce that you will be having X price, for example, wheat you will be having at this price. But now the government is having idea of MSP only for the procurement, but it has no control on the prices of the wheat in the open market, right? Until and unless there is substantial change, right? Keep it in mind, substantial change. If it is normal within the market regime, the government is having no control, right? So that means most of the goods price were decontrolled. That means it was open to the open market. Tax reforms, if you see the tax reforms, there has been a gradual reduction in individual direct taxation rates, which eventually reduces tax evasion. I think it is clear. At that time, taxation rate was as high as 97.75, and now it is 30%. 30% plus something cess and all those things for ultra rich people, right? But on an average, you can understand it to be 30%. Corporate taxes are also reduced, and now in the case of indirect taxation, we are having the concept of GST, right? Financial sector reforms. See, at that time, RBI was acting as an inspector, right? It was an absolute regulator. But after that, the role was changed to the facilitator, right? And if you see that financial sector, even if you see the banking sector, they are free to take certain decisions, right? But in the previous, in those eras, RBI was directing them, right? But now they are free to take certain decisions within the purview of the broader parameters framework defined by the RBI. Foreign and private investments were allowed in the banking sector with RBI, right? I think when I have discussed banking sector with you or not? A little bit of banking sector, some brief that what happened in 1990s. Any response? Whether I have discussed banking sector, a bit of banking sector in the previous classes. I discussed you that in 1990s, private players were allowed to enter the banking sector, as well as the foreign investment was allowed in the banking sector, right? So, okay, I spoke about rates. Okay, don't worry. We'll be discussing it in detail about but keep it in mind that in 1990s, foreign as well as the private sector was allowed to invest in the banking sector within the RBI framework, right? And then came foreign exchange reforms. Devaluation of rupee against foreign currency as to promote trade way forward for the rupee convertibility. This convertibility we will be discussing later on, but now you have only to understand convertibility means simply that you are free to convert dollar rupee. If this exchange is in the open market, then it is said to be convertible, right? If it is not exchanged in the open market, or it is to be exchanged at the RBI nominated shops or agencies, then it is said to be non-convertible, right? So all these steps resulted increase in the inflow of forex. So right now, if you talk about June 2020, it is 500 billion. I prepared these slides in June, right? Now this figure is 523, if I'm not wrong, right? Trade and investment policy reforms, liberalization of trade and investment initiative to increase the international competitiveness, right? This already I have discussed. Trade dismantling of quantitative restrictions, what I discussed with Quota Raj, right? It was done away with. Import licensing, it was done away with. Export duties in general have been removed. Privatization, right? I expect any question on this idea of privatization, disinvestment, and all these things. I expect question because this is going on nowadays. See, the idea is privatization means, for example, if you see that every ownership is said to be 100%. For example, if a company is having you will be saying that 100% capital is being owned by the company. Owner can be different. So initially what happened, the government company means the initial ownership of the government is of the government, 100% ownership is of the government, right? So what happens, that government reduces its stake. Reduction of this stake is said to be disinvestment or divestment. Disinvestment, divestment. The difference between disinvestment and divestment means there is minor difference, right? But if you want to understand that detail, then only I am telling you, but there's minor difference. Divestment means, for example, if there's a company, for example, oil companies, for example, BPCL. This BPCL is in the field of gas, oil refining, right? And any other, for example, pipeline business, right? If BPCL or any company is doing away with one of the segment, for example, BPCL says that I am doing away with the business of gas. That means it is coming out of one segment, and coming out of a single segment is said to be the divestment. Divestment means you are coming out of a segment, right? Disinvestment means that you are reducing your stake in the whole business. Like Tata Motors is looking to divesting JLR. Okay, good, right? So divestment means that you are exiting. The correct word is exit from a segment. This is divestment. And disinvestment, consider the whole. It is talking about, that means you are having 100 rupees in this investment. So if you are reducing 10%, that means you are reducing 10% in the whole property. It can be your gas, oil, and this pipeline business, right? So this is the difference between disinvestment and divestment, right? Now coming to this change in the, before this I'll be next slide. Where is next slide? Wait. See, nowadays you might be hearing very popular terms, strategic, non-strategic, right? See, as per the definition prevalent nowadays, what the government says that if the ownership is more than 50%, whosoever is holding more than 50% of the shares in the company, he is said to be the strategic partner. That means any individual who is holding 50% shares of the company, he is the strategic partner in the company. Keep it in mind. It can be 51, it can be any of the 70, 90, and it can go up to 100%. So any individual who is having the share more than 50% is the strategic partner. So as of now, at present, strategic partnership of the government means all the PSUs in which the government is holding shares more than 50% are said to be the government PSUs, right? Now, what about other 50%, right? Other 50% means this is being held by other stakeholders. That means it can be public, it can be institutions like LIC or any banks, right? It can be anybody, right? So strategic partner means any strategic ownership of the government means the government is holding more than 50% of the shares in the company. Right. So what is happening nowadays, you might be hearing a very popular term, strategic disinvestment. So coming to the concept, what we discussed, it is saying 50%. Disinvestment means the government is selling its assets, right? Yani reducing its stake. And strategic means less than more than 50%. That means strategic disinvestment means the government is reducing its role of a strategic partner. That means when the stake of the government will reduce less than 50%, that means when the government stake will be 49 and below, it will be said to be the strategic disinvestment, right? So whenever the government will be reducing its stake in the public sector below 50%, 49 and below, it will be said to be the strategic disinvestment. Keep it in mind, right? This is strategic disinvestment. So nowadays you might be hearing one another term, that the government is redefining the concept of the strategic and non-strategic, and verified reports in the newspaper states that the government has identified 18 sectors. It is subjected to the cabinet approval. 18 sectors had been identified as strategic, right? That means, and they are saying that government will be having 1 to 4 public sectors in these 18 sectors. That means the government will be holding more than 50% of the stake in these 18 sectors. So either there will be 18 companies, government companies, or maximum 72 government companies. Again, it is unverified, right? These are based upon the newspaper reports, and it is subjected to the cabinet approval, but almost it is the same thing. So the government had stated that they will be having 18 strategic sectors, and these strategic sectors, in one strategic sector they will be having 1 to 4. For example, if you talk about oil sector, so they will be having like ONGC will be there, right? And either they will only be having ONGC or other. For example, they might be having HPCL, IOCL. All other PSUs will either be merged with these PSUs, which will be defined as strategic, or they will be sold. So strategic means the government will be holding the strategic partnership in all these public sectors. Secondly, they are again also planning to redefine the structure of the public sector. That means they are also planning to say that now what we have discussed, that 50% strategic ownership will be is only held by the government if it is holding more than 50% of the stake in the public sector. Now they are coming up with the concept of stock holding company. This idea is very much popular in Singapore, right? Stock holding company. And I think Nayak committee, go through JP Nayak committee in banking sector. In banking sector, you are supposed to go, this is NAYAK, Nayak, JP Nayak. One committee was Urjit Patel, second Nachket More. I am telling you the names of committee. Nachket More committee, and third was Nayak committee, right? All these committees has recommended, has given the recommendations, and most of the recommendations of these committees were accepted by the government of India. And if you see the reforms in the banking sector, they are in line with the recommendations of these committees. For example, Urjit Patel committee talks about the acceptance of inflation targeting, what we discussed, right? This Nachket More committee talks about the financial inclusion. Many things the government has accepted, like the idea of the payment bank, right? Talking about the bringing all the people in the net of the banking sector, right? Financial inclusion. Nayak committee talks about the reforms in the banking sector, and they have given the idea of the stock holding company. Stock holding companies, what they are saying, they are given the one special term, BIC, banking banking investment company, BIC. They are saying this is a stock holding company, is banking investment company, and what they are saying that the government should form a company, and what the government should do, that the government should hold shares in the banks through the BIC, right? Rather than directly involving in the banking business, they should get involved in the BIC, and BIC should play in the market on the behalf of the government. For example, they will be playing in the market in the sense that when the stock markets of any banking sector is increasing, this company will be selling all the sectors, and with the future anticipation, the government will be investing in particular banking sector, right? So this is the idea of the BIC, what Nayak committee has recommended. Stockholding committee, what the idea of the stockholding committee is? Stockholding committee means that it is saying that, for example, if you talk about gas sector, so a stockholding idea is that every government company, right, dealing in the gas sector, gas business, will be dealt by the stockholding company. What if you see nowadays, what is happening, that if ONGC is there, IOCL is there, BPCL, HPCL is there, OIL companies, every company is being headed by a board of directors, and every company is having, there's duplication of management. Now what this idea is, stockholding company, they are saying that there will be a single company which will be managing the affairs of the gas sector. So this stockholding company will be acting as a management, as a board of directors for the sector rather than a company, right? For example, if you are talking about power sector, so there will be company, for example, energy stockholding company. This stockholding company will be acting as a management for every government power sector company, be it NTPC, be it PGCIL, be it NIPCO, be it NHPC, right? So stockholding company will be managing all the companies dealing with the power sector. So this is the idea of the stockholding company, and the government is aggressively working on all these ideas. So I expect that these questions will be, you can see all these type of questions be it in pre or mains, right? वो कैसे भी आपको दे सकते हैं, right? So this is the idea of the, so privatization means, coming to the idea of the privatization, change in the management of a PSU. See, management change means right now in the strategic partnership with the government, the management is being controlled by the government, right? But in case of privatization, this management is being controlled by the private players, right? Government participation will be there, but it will be subjected to the ownership, because right now if you are having more than 51%, then whole management, most of the management is being controlled by the government. But when this stack will go less than 50%, then government will act as a stakeholder, not the strategic stakeholder, because stakeholding will be depending upon the percentage of partnership, right? So privatization means change in the management of a PSU. That means the management of the PSU will be shifted from government to the private, and it can be, how it is possible? It can be possible by withdrawal of the government from ownership. That means going beyond 50%, below 50%, and the management of the PSU, or by outright sale. It can be a possibility that it is either you are going below 50%, or you are outright sale, means 100% is sold. That is what is happening in case of BPCL, Air India. They are selling these things 100%, whatever is the stack of the government, they are selling all its stack. That means this is outright sale, right? So the objective is to bring efficiency in the functioning of PSUs by adopting best practices. Globalization. See, I'll be discussing this later on. Globalization. Right? Any questions till now? Does change in management mean that person will be replaced, or the same person is person of private firm? No, see, if you see the management of the public sectors now, all these managers, all these board of directors are being appointed by the government of India through PESP, public sector, and public sector enterprise board. There is a board selection board, public enterprises selection board. There is a board which is, I think, under the Ministry of heavy industries, right? And this Ministry of Heavy Industries control this board, and finally it is being approved by the government of India, and that is basically by, there's a committee, appointments committee, right, that approve the selection of these all the board of directors. But in case of this disinvestment strategic sale, there will be no control of the government on the appointment of the directors. Those directors will be appointed, right? They will be appointed by the private people who will be the owner of the company. Yes, It can be a possibility if the private owner finds that the individual who is managing the company right now, the director of the company who is holding right now, he can continue with him. If he finds that he is efficient or he is in sync with the new management, right? So it's up to the equations between the people, the owners and the these management. Any other question? See, globalization is nothing but it is integration of the world, right? That means world without borders, right? So globalization, it's not, even if you see that in paper one, you are having the impact of globalization of social part. So globalization is not only about the economy part, but it is more of a social. And if you see the information technology, right, has revolutionized the idea of the globalization. So all these part, like for example, if you see this LP liberalization, privatization is a part of globalization, right? It's a part of globalization. So globalization is nothing but it is doing away with the borders, right? World without borders, and your globalization is promoting your liberalization as well as privatization, right? So privatization, the idea of the privatization is more of an internal inward idea. But if you see the this BPCL, the disinvestment of BPCL, you might be hearing that international bidders are have been asked to invest. And if you have gone through if you are going through the recent stories, so you will be hearing that this Reliance, right? What is happening with the Reliance? Most of the investors are from abroad, right? So this is basically globalization. In the globalized world, we are in the economic terms, liberalization is being promoted by the idea of the globalization, right? So investments are coming and all those things, right? Any other question? Is corporatization same as privatization? Sir, is so special about globalization and be a member of from the beginning. Is corporatization same as privatization? I heard that railway is being corporatized. Very good question. See, corporatization and corporatization is predecessor to the this privatization. What is the idea? See, what is happening nowadays, that railways, basically they are talking about corporatization of railways and these ordnance factories. What is happening in railways nowadays, that irrespective of their loss and profits, the employees of the railways are being provided salaries, isn't it, right? But now see, in the case of company like BSNL or any this public sector Maharatnas, for example, if you talk about ONGC, the salaries of these people are subjected to the profits. If the company is not having the profit, there are various variable component in the salary. This variable component is subjected to the profits of the company. This public sector are being run by in the corporate culture. That means if they are having the profits, then only they will be giving more salaries to the people. But in the case of railways, if they have fixed the basic as, for example, 10,000, and if they are said that you will be getting 20,000, so irrespective of the loss or profit, the person will be having 20,000. So if you go through the media or the news stories, every Diwali a bonus is announced irrespective of the loss and profit of the railways. In case of, if it is the structure is being converted into the corporate, this bonus will be subjected to the profits of the railways. So corporatization is predecessor to the privatization. It's not the sole privatization, because corporatization is an idea to bring in the efficiency in the functioning of the government company. First, it is basically government company, and prior to that, it is government department, then government company, then public sector unit, then this private. This is the idea. Government departments are completely, absolutely held by the government, right? Then came the government company. These government companies, though, are held by the government of India, but they are involved in the productions. So what the government is talking right now, they are talking about a corporatization of their government companies, be it ordnance factories, be it railways, and privatization is being done of the public sector units, right? So this is the classification you have to understand in this manner. What is so special about globalization of 1990 when we were member of WTO and GATE from the beginning? When we were, the specifics of the 1991 was, I already discussed that ideally we were never closed economy. Keep it in mind, we were never closed, right? And even if you see nowadays, we are not open. Right now we are not open absolutely, because we are having certain restrictions. So at that time we were part of gate, right? But still we were not following all the flexibilities under that regime, right? That we will discuss when we will discussing the WTO regime. Then we will discuss all the things about gate and WTO and all those things, right? But you have to understand that in 1990s, though uh, uh, we were following the gate regime, but we were not following them fully, right? Is Atmanirbhar Bharat a restriction to globalization? See, Nitya, your question is very valid. Even if you see the clarifications from the government side, they are again and again clarifying this argument, because economists are saying that what the government is adopting under the regime of Atmanirbhar Bharat, that is basically disastrous for the economy, right? In the sense that you cannot do away with the idea of the globalization, right? So the best idea is to be competitive, right? Rather than adopting the pre-1990s era tactics, right? So it's better to be competitive, right? Because again, if you are not allowing them, if you this recently BSNL was putting tendering for this 5G, right? And when the tender came for 5G, then the individual filed an application with the government of India that the bidder should be Indian company, right? The bidder should only be the Indian company, and everybody knows that there is no single bidder in the telecom sector in India who can carry the implementation of 5G, right? And so that means that in India we are not having the companies which are so much competitive enough at par with the international companies, right? So this thing we have to, yes, you are saying absolutely right, that Atmanirbhar this package or so called to an extent is again going to the pre-1990s era. Right? But let's see, the government is again and again coming up with the clarification that we are not targeting, we are not demotivating the this globalization. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. That see, the key of globalization is quality, but nothing else. If you are qualitative, right, then sky is the limit. But the issue with the India with the production is that we are not qualitative, right? That is the only reason. Any other question? Okay, thank you very much.